The Mercedes rolled through my open bay door while sparks were still falling from the lift frame. Rebecca Hartwell, the HOA president, parked it sideways in the center of my workshop and blocked 3 active jobs before my welders could even shut their torches down. The smell of hot steel and brake dust hit the room at the same time. 2 customer trucks were stuck behind her car, my delivery forklift could not reach the loading lane, and the fire-rated steel door system I controlled sat open with a permitted safety inspection scheduled for that afternoon. Then she stepped out in white heels and said, "Your little shop is creating a neighborhood nuisance." That was her first mistake. Her second was doing it under 4 security cameras and a posted industrial work permit. The grinder in Miguel's hand slowed to a stop. The whole workshop went quiet except for the ticking engine of her Mercedes. Sunlight poured through the bay door and flashed across the polished hood like the car belonged in a showroom, not 10 feet from welding tables, steel racks, and compressed gas cylinders. I raised one hand to keep my crew still. Nobody needed to touch her car. Nobody needed to raise their voice. That room was already full of proof. Rebecca adjusted her sunglasses and looked around my shop like she was inspecting a messy garage sale. Behind her, 2 HOA board members stood outside near the curb with clipboards. One of them was filming. Of course he was. They had not come to solve a problem. They had come to create a record that made me look like the problem. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 42 years old, and I own Walker Custom Fabrication on a corner lot just outside the Willow Creek HOA boundary. Not inside it. Beside it. That difference mattered more than Rebecca wanted to admit. My workshop had city permits, commercial zoning, fire inspections, insurance documentation, noise compliance reports, and more cameras than a bank lobby. I learned a long time ago that when entitled people start using paper as a weapon, you keep better paper. Rebecca pointed toward the steel beams stacked along the wall. "This is exactly what residents have been complaining about," she said. "Noise, fumes, traffic, and visual blight." The word blight landed hard in the room. Miguel looked down at his boots. My apprentice, Tyler, stopped moving beside the parts washer. 3 months earlier, Rebecca had started calling my shop an eyesore at HOA meetings. 2 months earlier, her board sent letters to the city claiming I was operating illegally. 1 month earlier, she tried to have delivery trucks ticketed for parking on a public street. Now she had parked a Mercedes inside my workshop and acted like she was the victim. A customer walked in from the front office holding a signed invoice. He saw the blocked bay, the silent welders, and the white Mercedes sitting in the work zone. His jaw tightened. "Can I pick up today or not?" he asked. I looked at Rebecca. She smiled before I answered. That smile told me she thought she had found pressure that worked. Then my phone buzzed on the desk behind me. A city inspector was 10 minutes away. The city inspector stepped through the front office door carrying a tablet and a hard hat. The smell of hot metal still hung in the air. Rebecca turned immediately. Her smile changed. It became brighter, more confident, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. The inspector introduced himself and glanced around the workshop. His eyes landed on the blocked bay, then on the customer trucks, then on the Mercedes sitting in the center of the work zone. A small wrinkle appeared on his forehead. That caught my attention. Rebecca started talking before anyone asked a question. She pointed toward steel stock. She pointed toward welding stations. She pointed toward the loading area. Her voice echoed across the concrete floor. The inspector listened quietly. He typed notes into his tablet. The room stayed still. Even the forklifts remained parked. Then he asked a simple question. "Who owns the vehicle in the restricted work area?" The workshop became very quiet. Rebecca raised her hand. The inspector looked back at the car. He walked around it slowly. His boots clicked against the concrete. He stopped near a painted yellow safety line running across the floor. The Mercedes sat directly inside a designated fabrication zone. He looked at me, then at Rebecca, then back at the warning signs mounted on the wall. One sign specifically prohibited unauthorized vehicles beyond that point. The inspector photographed it. Rebecca's confidence slipped for half a second. Just half a second. Then she recovered and started talking about HOA complaints again. The inspector did not seem interested. He asked another question instead. "How long has the vehicle been here?" Rebecca did not answer immediately. Neither did I. The security cameras would answer that better than either of us. The customer waiting near the office folded his arms. Another delivery truck pulled into the lot outside. Its backup alarm echoed through the building. The driver stepped out, saw the blocked bay, and stopped walking. One more delayed delivery. One more witness. The situation kept growing. The inspector eventually completed his review and handed me a digital acknowledgement form. No violations. No citations. No warnings. Rebecca's expression hardened. The two HOA board members outside lowered their clipboards. Their afternoon was not going the way they expected. As the inspector prepared to leave, he glanced once more at the Mercedes. "You may want to move that soon," he said. "This is an active industrial workspace." Rebecca thanked him politely. Then she ignored the advice completely. That was escalation number 2. The inspector's truck disappeared down the street. The sound faded. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rebecca handed me an envelope. White. Official. HOA letterhead. She looked pleased. Very pleased. I opened it right there beside the welding tables. Inside was a formal notice claiming my workshop activities were reducing neighborhood property values. My welders stared in disbelief. The customer beside me actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Rebecca crossed her arms. She expected an argument. She expected frustration, maybe even anger. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and placed it into my desk drawer. Every camera in the building recorded the moment. Her smile faded. Across the room, my operations manager, Chris, quietly walked over carrying a clipboard. He leaned close, enough that only I could hear him. Then he pointed toward a section of the permit packet from that morning's inspection. I looked down at the highlighted paragraph and read it twice. I looked down at the highlighted paragraph and felt the room narrow around it. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink. Chris tapped the section once with his finger. Then he stepped back. The permit covered a temporary industrial safety enclosure scheduled for installation later that week. We had already been approved to isolate part of the fabrication floor during a large structural welding project. Nothing unusual. Nothing secret. Just paperwork. Legitimate paperwork. Across the shop, Rebecca was still talking to her HOA board members. She never noticed the permit packet. Not yet. The sound of an air compressor kicked on near the back wall. A forklift beeped outside. My crew waited for instructions. Every lost minute was costing money now. I folded the permit packet and slipped it into my desk drawer beside the HOA notice. Then I walked back toward the center bay. Rebecca stood beside her car scrolling through her phone. Completely comfortable. Completely certain she controlled the situation. "When are you moving it?" I asked. She looked up. "When I am finished." Her answer was immediate. Practiced. Like she had already rehearsed it. The customer waiting near the office shook his head and left. His truck started outside a moment later. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. One job delayed. The first of the day. By late afternoon, 2 more customers had rescheduled pickups. The welding torches stayed cold. The workshop felt wrong without the constant crackle of sparks. Silence settled where work should have been happening. Rebecca eventually drove away just before closing time. The Mercedes disappeared down the road. The moment the taillights vanished, my crew came alive. Machines restarted. Steel moved. Orders resumed. Yet the damage had already happened. I spent the evening reviewing security footage. For camera angles covered the entire building. The blue glow from the monitors filled my office. Outside, darkness settled across the industrial park. The footage showed Rebecca entering the workshop that morning. Then something unexpected appeared. I rewound the video. Played it again. Rewound it once more. 3 days earlier, the same Mercedes had entered my property. Not into the workshop. Into the loading yard. She had stayed for 20 minutes. 2 weeks earlier, she had stopped near the fabrication entrance. Another camera captured it. My eyes narrowed. Rebecca had not chosen my workshop randomly. This had been building for weeks. Maybe longer. I pulled additional footage. More appearances surfaced. Different days. Different times. Always near the property. Always watching. The realization sat heavy in the room. Then another email notification arrived. HOA compliance notice. I opened it. A second complaint. Different wording. Same accusation. Visual impact. Community concern. Property values. I almost laughed. Instead, I saved a copy and added it to a growing folder labeled HOA. The folder was becoming thick. Very thick. The next morning, Chris arrived carrying construction drawings for the upcoming enclosure project. Large sheets of paper rolled beneath his arm. He spread them across the conference table. Blue lines. Measurements. Material specifications. Steel posts. Temporary safety walls. Controlled access points. Everything approved. Everything documented. My eyes moved slowly across the plans. Then I noticed something about the layout. Something very simple. Something completely legal. Chris noticed it too. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, a familiar engine rolled into the parking lot. We both looked toward the window. The white Mercedes had returned. The white Mercedes rolled into the parking lot and stopped in almost the exact same place as before. Morning sunlight flashed across the windshield. Chris and I stood beside the conference table looking through the office window. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. The construction drawings remained spread across the table between us. Blue lines, measurements, safety barriers, access control points. Every detail approved and scheduled. Outside, Rebecca stepped out of the car carrying another folder. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no often enough. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the office. Beyond the glass, my welders were already preparing for the day. Forklifts moved steel. Chains rattled. Air tools hissed to life. Then Rebecca walked straight past the front office and headed toward the fabrication floor. That caught my attention immediately. Visitors were supposed to check in first. She knew that. Everybody knew that. By the time I reached the workshop, she was already standing inside the main bay. The sound of grinders echoed off the walls. Bright sparks sprayed from a welding station near the back. Rebecca looked around like she owned the building. Then she pointed toward a stack of steel tubing scheduled for a municipal project. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she announced loudly. Several employees stopped working long enough to look up. One customer waiting near the service counter frowned. Another pulled out a phone. The room felt different now. More people were paying attention. Rebecca seemed to enjoy that. She opened her folder and began reading from a list of complaints. Noise, traffic, visual impact, community concerns. The same phrases again. The same script. Chris quietly started noting the time on a clipboard. Another camera above the bay door watched everything. Rebecca never looked up at it. Then she walked directly into the restricted fabrication zone. Yellow safety markings stretched across the floor. Warning signs hung from steel posts. She stepped over all of them. My foreman, Miguel, immediately shut down his welding station. The sudden silence felt sharp. Rebecca kept walking. She stopped beside a partially assembled structural frame and placed her folder on top of it. The move seemed small. It was not. Every employee in the building noticed. She was no longer making complaints. She was interfering with active work. A customer near the office counter shook his head and left. Another delayed order. Another witness. Rebecca eventually turned toward me. "You need to understand something," she said. "The HOA is not going away." Her voice echoed through the bay. I looked at the folder resting on the steel frame, then at the yellow lines around her feet, then at the cameras mounted overhead. She thought pressure created leverage. She did not realize documentation created leverage too. Around noon, she finally left. The workshop breathed again the moment her car disappeared. Machines restarted. Torches lit. Work resumed. But the interruption had already cost us another half day. That afternoon, I met with the contractor responsible for the upcoming enclosure project. He arrived carrying rolled plans and permit copies. We walked the fabrication floor together. Tape measures clicked open. Notes were recorded. Distances were verified. The contractor stopped near the center bay and studied the layout for several seconds. Then he pointed toward the exact location where Rebecca kept parking and standing. "This entire section falls inside the temporary safety perimeter," he said. I looked down at the plans, then back at the floor. The realization settled slowly. Not because it was complicated, because it was so simple. Every requirement, every measurement, every approval, everything led back to the same spot. Then the contractor asked a question that changed the entire direction of the project. "Has anyone told her what happens when construction starts? I need the text of Part 4, or at least the title and outline already approved, to continue Part 5 while keeping the same characters, setting, timeline, and story continuity. Without the previous section, I cannot reliably continue the narrative and maintain consistency. Please paste Part 4, and I will write Part 5 in the exact format and style you specified." The next week started with the kind of silence that never means peace. It was the silence that comes right before another problem arrives. I stepped out onto my porch just after sunrise, coffee warming my hands, and immediately noticed a bright orange notice taped to my front gate. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze. The smell of wet grass mixed with fresh printer ink as I peeled it off and read the latest accusation. According to the HOA, I was now responsible for unauthorized modifications to community infrastructure. I actually laughed. A short, tired laugh. The claim made no sense. I had not touched a single inch of community property. But that was the pattern. Every time one accusation failed, they invented another. By noon, 3 more letters arrived. One demanded a special hearing. Another threatened additional fines. The third claimed my property somehow created a safety concern for the neighborhood. The language sounded official, but the details were vague. Deliberately vague. That afternoon, I attended the hearing anyway. The community room smelled like stale coffee and air freshener. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Margaret sat at the front table with the same polished smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. Several board members avoided eye contact. A few neighbors sat quietly in the back rows. I brought photographs, surveys, permits, and records. Facts. She brought opinions. For nearly an hour, she spoke about community standards, neighborhood harmony, and property values. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Every accusation somehow circled back to me. When I presented documents proving her claims were false, she barely looked at them. Instead, she pushed for a vote on additional penalties. The result was exactly what she wanted. The board approved another round of fines. Walking back to my truck, I felt the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The Texas heat reflected off the pavement. For the first time since this started, I realized something important. They were not trying to enforce rules. They were trying to exhaust me. They wanted legal bills. They wanted frustration. They wanted me to give up voluntarily. That realization changed everything. That evening, Sarah called. I could hear concern in her voice. She asked how much longer this fight could continue. I understood why she was worried. The paperwork was piling up. The threats kept escalating. But while organizing documents on my dining room table, I noticed something strange. Several HOA notices listed dates that did not match official meeting records. One approval referenced a meeting that never appeared in the public minutes. Another carried signatures that looked suspiciously identical. The air suddenly felt different, like the moment before a storm breaks. I spread every document across the table. Hours passed. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness. Inside, the only sound was the turning of pages. The more I compared records, the worse it looked. Votes appeared before meetings happened. Authorizations existed without supporting documents. Financial approvals referenced accounts that were never disclosed to homeowners. At 2 in the morning, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the growing stack of inconsistencies. My first legal challenge had failed. My attempts to reason with them had failed. But this was different. This was not about property lines anymore. This was not even about the fines. Hidden beneath all the harassment was something much larger. Something they never expected anyone to notice. For months, they had acted untouchable because everyone focused on the obvious conflicts. Nobody was looking behind the curtain. Nobody except me. And for the first time since Margaret declared war on my family property, I finally saw the first crack in her perfect empire. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office carrying 2 storage boxes filled with copies, notes, and highlighted documents. The smell of old paper and floor polish greeted me the moment I stepped through the doors. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of public records that most people never bothered to examine. That was exactly why people like Margaret stayed comfortable for so long. They counted on nobody looking closely. I spent hours comparing HOA filings against county submissions. The deeper I dug, the stranger everything became. Several documents referenced easements that did not match the recorded surveys. Financial disclosures listed infrastructure projects with costs that seemed inflated far beyond reasonable estimates. One road improvement project carried a price tag nearly double what similar county projects had cost. Another filing referenced consulting services provided by a company sharing the same mailing address as one of the HOA board members. By lunchtime, my legal pad was filled with arrows, dates, and questions. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. What started as harassment against my family property appeared connected to something much larger. The fines, the zoning changes, the pressure campaigns. Suddenly, they looked less like personal attacks and more like distractions. That realization sat heavily in my stomach. Outside, the summer heat shimmered above the parking lot. I could smell hot asphalt through the open doorway. My phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Henderson, a retired accountant who lived 3 streets over. We had spoken briefly at one of the hearings. Her voice sounded nervous. She asked if we could meet somewhere private. An hour later, we sat inside a quiet diner near the highway. The smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. She slid a thick envelope across the table without saying a word. Inside were copies of HOA financial statements she had saved years earlier while serving on a budget committee. The moment I compared them to the versions currently filed with residents, my pulse quickened. Entire figures had changed. Reserve balances appeared different. Expense categories had been moved or relabeled. Some transactions disappeared altogether. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward and lowered her voice. She told me several former board members had quietly resigned over the years after asking too many questions. According to her, nobody ever received clear answers. People simply stopped pushing. Fear of legal expenses and retaliation kept everyone silent. As she spoke, pieces of the puzzle started fitting together. Back at home that evening, Sarah helped organize everything across the dining room table. The same table where our grandfather used to spread maps and property surveys decades earlier. The scent of old wood mixed with fresh coffee as we worked late into the night. Every document revealed another inconsistency. Every discrepancy connected to another decision that somehow benefited the same small circle of people. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Buried inside a county development packet was a consulting agreement connected to the emergency zoning modification that had affected our land. The consulting company had a different name, but the registered agent matched an address linked to Rick Thornwell's business office. I stared at the page for several seconds before reading it again. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed distant. For months, I believed the fight centered on property ownership. Now it appeared our land had simply been one piece of a much larger machine. A machine generating money, influence, and control. Margaret and Rick had spent years building an image of civic leadership, community improvement, neighborhood protection. But the paperwork told a different story. The first crack I noticed in their empire was no longer a crack. It was becoming a fault line. And for the first time since returning home, I realized the people responsible for targeting my family might not be worried about losing an argument. They might be worried about something far more dangerous. They might be worried about the truth becoming public. The following week felt less like a property dispute and more like an investigation. Every morning began with stacks of documents and ended with new questions. The smell of coffee became permanent in my kitchen. Highlighters, folders, and county records covered every available surface. Sarah joked that the dining room looked more like a law office than a family home. The funny part was that she was right. What we uncovered during those days changed the entire direction of the fight. It started with meeting minutes. Official HOA records claimed certain votes had been approved unanimously. But when I compared attendance sheets against the signatures attached to those votes, the numbers did not match. In several cases, board members supposedly approved decisions while documented as absent from the meeting. At first, I thought it might be clerical error. Then I found another example. Then another. By the end of the day, I had identified nearly a dozen questionable approvals connected to major expenditures and zoning recommendations. The air felt heavy as I spread everything across the table. This was no longer coincidence. It was a pattern. 2 days later, I submitted formal public records requests through the county. The clerk handling the request recognized my name from previous visits. She raised an eyebrow when she saw the scope of the documents I wanted. Development communications, permit correspondence, infrastructure consultations, environmental reviews, everything connected to the projects surrounding our land. The process took time, but when the records finally arrived, they brought answers nobody expected. One email chain immediately caught my attention. The messages discussed development priorities months before public hearings ever occurred. Community leaders appeared to be coordinating outcomes before residents were notified. Another exchange referenced land access issues involving our property long before the adverse possession claim surfaced. Reading those messages sent a chill down my spine despite the summer heat outside. The smell of fresh rain drifted through the open window while I sat there rereading the same paragraphs. They had been planning around our land long before I returned home from deployment. The claim that everything happened naturally suddenly looked ridiculous. Then came the financial records. Mrs. Henderson introduced me to another former volunteer named Carl Jensen. a retired civil engineer. Quiet man, sharp memory. He carried 2 weathered binders into my garage one Saturday morning. The scent of motor oil mixed with old paper as he placed them on my workbench. Carl had served on an advisory committee years earlier and kept copies of infrastructure budgets. Together we compared them against current disclosures. Several projects had ballooned in cost without clear explanation. Some contractors appeared repeatedly despite competitive bidding requirements. Others shared business connections with individuals involved in HOA leadership. Carl shook his head as he reviewed the numbers. He had spent 40 years managing construction projects and said the discrepancies made no practical sense. That was the moment I realized something important. The evidence was no longer coming from me alone. Independent people were noticing the same inconsistencies. Different backgrounds, different experiences, same conclusions. The walls around the truth were starting to crack. Meanwhile, Margaret continued acting as though nothing had changed. New notices appeared in my mailbox. Additional warnings arrived through certified mail. The language grew more aggressive. The threats became more urgent. But something had shifted. The intimidation no longer carried the same weight. Every new letter felt less like authority and more like panic. One evening, while reviewing another batch of county correspondence, I found the document that connected everything. A consulting report used to justify critical zoning recommendations. Buried in the disclosure section was a reference to financial interests that should have triggered conflict reviews. Those reviews never happened. The room fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah looked across the table and immediately knew I had found something significant. For months, we had been searching for proof that the system was not operating honestly. Now the paper sitting in front of me was more than suspicion, more than theory. It was the first piece of evidence that directly connected decisions affecting our property to undisclosed interests behind the scenes. And once that document existed, the entire story stopped being about what they had done to my family. It became about what they had been doing to everyone. The discovery changed everything because for the first time, I was no longer carrying the weight of the investigation alone. Word traveled quietly through the neighborhood, not through gossip, but through conversations between people who had spent years feeling ignored. The following Saturday morning, my garage became an unexpected meeting place. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil and cut grass drifting in from the open driveway. Folding chairs appeared one by one. So did neighbors. Some I knew well. Others I had only waved to over the years. By 10 o'clock, nearly a dozen people sat beneath the old fluorescent lights listening as I laid documents across a workbench. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Every person in that room had their own story. Mrs. Henderson described budget concerns that were dismissed without explanation. Carl Jensen explained how infrastructure estimates never matched industry standards. A retired school administrator named Linda produced years of correspondence showing homeowner complaints that simply vanished from official records. Another neighbor brought copies of assessment notices that seemed to target residents who questioned board decisions. Piece by piece, the pattern expanded. What happened to my family property was not unique. It was simply the most visible example. The realization settled heavily over the room. You could hear the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant chirping of birds outside. For years, people believed they were isolated cases. Now they were seeing the bigger picture. That afternoon, we organized everything. Sarah created timelines. Carl reviewed engineering records. Mrs. Henderson cross-checked financial statements. Linda cataloged communications and homeowner complaints. What amazed me most was how quickly the group transformed into a team. These were ordinary people, teachers, retirees, small business owners, parents, veterans. Yet together they possessed decades of experience and knowledge. The same people Margaret had spent years underestimating were suddenly working side by side. Over the next 2 weeks, the evidence grew rapidly. New documents arrived almost daily. Homeowners who had stayed silent for years began sharing records they had saved in desk drawers and filing cabinets. One family provided photographs connected to disputed development projects. Another resident supplied archived newsletters that contradicted official timelines. The stack of evidence became so large that we converted part of my grandfather's old barn into a temporary archive. Walking through it felt surreal. The scent of aged wood and dust mixed with fresh printer paper. Tables were covered with folders organized by subject. Financial records on one side, zoning materials on another. communications, and meeting minutes in separate sections. Every item told part of the story. Then came the breakthrough none of us expected. A former board member named David contacted me directly. He had moved away years earlier and rarely spoke about HOA matters. His voice sounded cautious when we first talked on the phone. He agreed to meet at a quiet diner outside town. Rain tapped softly against the windows while we sat in a corner booth reviewing documents. David explained that during his final year on the board, he raised concerns about several contracts and voting procedures. Shortly afterward, he found himself excluded from important discussions. Eventually, he resigned. Before leaving, however, he kept copies of correspondence related to internal board communications. When he opened his briefcase and slid the folder across the table, I immediately understood why he had protected it for so long. The contents connected multiple decisions directly to private discussions that homeowners never knew existed. Recommendations appeared coordinated before official meetings. Outcomes seemed predetermined long before votes occurred. It was the strongest evidence we had seen so far. Driving home through the evening rain, windshield wipers moving steadily across the glass, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Hope. Real hope. Not because the fight was over. It was far from over. But because the truth was no longer hidden inside scattered records and unanswered questions. It was becoming organized, documented, verified. More importantly, it was no longer my battle alone. An entire group of neighbors now stood together, united by facts instead of fear. And for the first time since this conflict began, the people who built their power on silence were facing something they could not easily control. They were facing a community that had finally started paying attention. By the time October arrived, our operation had become surprisingly disciplined. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, the old barn behind my grandfather's house filled with the quiet sounds of preparation. Pages turning, laptops humming, coffee brewing, the scent of aged timber mixed with fresh ink and determination. What began as frustrated neighbors sharing stories had evolved into something much more effective. We had evidence. We had witnesses. Most importantly, we had a plan. Carl built detailed timelines connecting development decisions, contractor payments, and zoning changes. Sarah organized every document into searchable categories. Mrs. Henderson created financial summaries that translated thousands of pages into clear, understandable reports. Linda reviewed years of homeowner complaints and matched them against board actions. Everyone contributed something. Every skill mattered. One evening, we gathered around a folding table covered with maps, records, and county filings. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof overhead. The atmosphere reminded me of planning sessions during deployment. Different mission. Same principle. Facts first. Emotions second. We knew rushing forward would be a mistake. Margaret and Rick had spent years building influence. If we wanted accountability, everything had to be precise. Every claim needed documentation. Every allegation needed proof. The next step was identifying where the evidence should go. We consulted attorneys experienced in property law and nonprofit governance. We spoke with county officials responsible for records compliance. We reviewed reporting procedures for potential ethics concerns. The process was slower than many people wanted, but slow was exactly what made it effective. Unlike the people we were investigating, we intended to do everything correctly. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA intensified. New violation notices continued arriving. Additional fines appeared without explanation. Certified letters landed in mailboxes across the neighborhood. Several residents who had joined our efforts suddenly found themselves facing unusual enforcement actions. The pattern was obvious. Intimidation. But something unexpected happened. Instead of scaring people away, it convinced more homeowners to participate. Every new notice created another witness. Every questionable action generated another document. The strategy that had worked for years was beginning to backfire. One Saturday afternoon, I attended a community meeting held at the clubhouse. The room smelled of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Margaret stood confidently at the front as she always did. Her voice carried the same polished certainty. Community standards. Transparency. Responsible leadership. The familiar phrases rolled out. Effortlessly. But this time the room felt different. People listened more carefully. They asked more questions. Some requested clarification about finances. Others wanted explanations for recent enforcement decisions. Small questions. Reasonable questions. Yet I noticed something I had never seen before. Margaret hesitated. Only briefly. Just a second or two. But it was there. The confidence that once seemed unshakable now carried tiny cracks. After the meeting, several homeowners approached me quietly in the parking lot. The cool evening air smelled of approaching rain. They wanted to know what we had discovered. I did not share accusations. I shared facts, public records, financial discrepancies, documented inconsistencies. Nothing more, nothing less. The reactions were revealing. Most people were not angry. They were disappointed. They had trusted the system. Learning that questions existed was unsettling enough. Back at the barn, our group made the final decision. We would prepare a comprehensive package containing every verified finding, supporting documents, timelines, financial comparisons, witness statements, public records, everything organized professionally and backed by evidence. No speculation, no exaggeration, just facts. Over the next several weeks, we worked late into the night assembling it. The stack grew thicker with every session. Boxes filled with carefully labeled folders. Digital archives mirrored physical records. Multiple copies were prepared. Safeguards were established. By the time we finished, the evidence represented months of investigation and years of overlooked questions. Looking across the completed files, I felt the same sensation I experienced the first time I noticed inconsistencies in those records months earlier. Except now the feeling was stronger. Back then I had discovered a crack. Now we were standing in front of a wall that was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The people responsible still believed they controlled the narrative. They still believed they could outlast criticism and pressure homeowners into silence. What they did not realize was that the real battle was no longer happening in meetings, violation notices, or neighborhood politics. It was happening inside those boxes of evidence. And very soon, those boxes were going to reach people with the authority to ask questions that could no longer be ignored. The turning point arrived on a cold Thursday morning just after sunrise. A thin layer of fog drifted across the fields behind my property, and the smell of damp earth filled the air as I carried another box of records into the barn. My phone rang before I reached the door. The county investigator assigned to review part of the documentation wanted to schedule a formal meeting. His voice remained professional, careful, and measured, but one sentence immediately caught my attention. He said the materials we submitted had raised concerns that required additional examination. I stood there for several seconds, staring across the pasture while the weight of those words settled in. For months we had been collecting facts. Now those facts were beginning to move through official channels. That afternoon our entire group gathered around the work tables inside the barn. The familiar sounds of pages turning and laptop keyboards clicking filled the room. Sarah reviewed the latest correspondence. Carl updated timelines. Mrs. Henderson cross-referenced financial disclosures one more time. Nobody celebrated. We all understood that scrutiny cuts both ways. Every claim had to withstand examination. Every document needed verification. But beneath the caution, there was a growing sense that events were accelerating. Over the following week, requests for additional records began appearing. Some came from county offices. Others arrived through attorneys representing homeowners who had heard rumors about the investigation. Questions that had been ignored for years suddenly demanded answers. The pressure shifted direction. For the first time, it was not residents being forced to explain themselves. It was leadership. Then came the community meeting. The largest attendance anyone could remember. Every seat filled. People lined the walls. The room felt warmer than usual from the crowd, carrying the mixed sense of coffee, paper, and nervous anticipation. Margaret entered with the same polished appearance she always maintained, but something was different. The confidence remained, yet it looked practiced now rather than natural. As discussions began, homeowners raised questions supported by documents rather than opinions. Financial discrepancies, contracting procedures, voting records, development approvals, one after another. Calm, respectful, specific. The atmosphere changed with each question. For years, leadership had controlled the conversation. Now the conversation was controlling them. Several board members appeared uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Rick attempted to dismiss concerns as misunderstandings, but the responses no longer landed the way they once had. Too many people had seen too many records. Facts have a strange power. Once enough people understand them, they become difficult to bury. The most revealing moment happened near the end of the meeting. A homeowner stood and referenced one of the consulting agreements connected to the zoning actions affecting my family's land. Another resident followed with questions about contractor relationships. Then a third asked why certain disclosures appeared incomplete. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder. Looking around the room, I realized the balance had shifted. Not because anyone had won. Not yet. But because the illusion of unquestioned authority had finally broken. Outside, the evening air felt cool against my face as residents slowly filtered into the parking lot. Small groups formed beneath streetlights. Conversations continued long after the meeting ended. People compared notes, shared experiences, discussed records. The community that once whispered behind closed doors was now speaking openly. Back at home, I sat on the porch with Sarah watching distant lights flicker across neighboring properties. The smell of fresh cut hay drifted from a nearby field. Neither of us said much. We did not need to. Months earlier this fight had seemed impossible. A single family against an entrenched system. Now the situation looked very different. The evidence was documented. The questions were public. The scrutiny was growing. Most importantly, the people responsible could no longer control who was paying attention. And deep down, I think they understood something that night. The issue was no longer whether they could pressure one property owner into giving up. The issue was whether their entire structure could survive the truth that was steadily coming into the light. The final chapter unfolded slowly, which somehow made it even more satisfying. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no grand speeches. Just the steady weight of facts doing what facts eventually do when enough people refuse to ignore them. Winter arrived across the Texas countryside, bringing crisp mornings and clear skies. Frost coated the grass around my grandfather's property while the first official findings began circulating through the community. The smell of wood smoke drifted from distant chimneys as neighbors gathered in small groups, discussing developments that only months earlier would have sounded impossible. Independent reviews confirmed many of the concerns residents had raised. Financial reporting practices came under scrutiny. Several development decisions were reevaluated. Internal procedures that had operated without meaningful oversight for years suddenly faced examination. The people who once dismissed every question as troublemaking found themselves answering questions instead. One by one, members of the old leadership structure stepped aside. Some resigned quietly. Others simply stopped attending meetings. Margaret remained longer than most, but even she could not escape the reality unfolding around her. The authority she once carried so effortlessly had depended on confidence and control. Once homeowners gained access to information, both began to disappear. The final community meeting felt completely different from the ones that came before. The clubhouse still smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. Yet the atmosphere had changed entirely. Residents spoke openly. Financial reports were presented in greater detail. Independent reviews were discussed without hostility. For the first time in years, the room felt like a community rather than a courtroom. Sitting near the back, I listened more than I spoke. This story had started because someone tried to take advantage of my family's land while believing nobody would notice. Somewhere along the way, it became about something much larger. It became about accountability, about transparency, about ordinary people discovering that systems only remain fair when people pay attention to them. A few weeks later, county records officially confirmed the protection of our property rights and resolved several disputes that had fueled the conflict from the beginning. Standing near the old earth dam one cold afternoon, I watched sunlight shimmer across the water exactly the way it had when my grandfather showed me this place as a child. The air smelled clean. The only sound was wind moving through the trees and water gently touching the shoreline. After everything that happened, that simple moment meant more than any legal document ever could. Sarah joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us said much. We just stood there looking across the land our family had protected for generations. The same land that almost became another line item in somebody else's development plan. Behind us, the community continued rebuilding trust. New leadership emerged. Procedures changed. Residents became more involved. Questions were no longer treated as threats. They were treated as responsibilities. Looking back, I realized the biggest mistake our opponents made was assuming people would stay isolated. They believed pressure worked because individuals felt alone. The moment neighbors started sharing information, everything changed. The truth spread faster than fear. The records survived longer than the intimidation. The facts outlasted the politics. Sometimes people ask whether the fight was worth it. I always give the same answer. Every late night, every box of records, every frustrating meeting, every moment of doubt. Absolutely worth it. Because in the end, we did not just protect a piece of property. We reminded an entire community that power works best when it is accountable. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers the people who care for it. Standing beside that water, watching the winter sun settle over the fields, I finally understood what he meant. The property remained. The community endured. The truth came out. And the people who thought they could quietly rewrite the rules discovered something they never expected. Justice is not loud. It is patient. It is persistent. And sooner or later, it always arrives. Spring arrived almost before I noticed it. The fields around the property turned green again, wildflowers appeared along the fence lines, and the old gravel road leading to my grandfather's land sounded exactly the way it had when I was a kid. Every crunch beneath my truck tires carried a memory. Every familiar landmark reminded me how close we had come to losing something that could never truly be replaced. Months had passed since the investigation changed the course of our community, yet the effects continued to ripple outward. The barn that once held stacks of evidence returned to its original purpose. The folding tables disappeared. The file boxes were archived. The long nights of research finally gave way to ordinary evenings again. Sometimes I would walk through the property just before sunset, listening to the wind move through the trees while the scent of fresh grass filled the air. Those quiet moments felt different now, not because the land had changed, but because I had. One Saturday morning, a neighborhood gathering took place near the community center. Families brought food. Children played in the open field. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another a year earlier now stood together, sharing stories and laughing. Watching it all unfold, I realized something important. The greatest victory was never about documents, hearings, or property lines. It was about restoring trust. Trust that rules would apply fairly. Trust that questions could be asked without fear. Trust that ordinary people still had a voice. Carl eventually returned to his retirement projects. Mrs. Henderson became something of a local legend for her attention to financial details. Linda helped establish new homeowner transparency committees. Sarah remained exactly who she had always been. Steady, practical, the kind of person who quietly carries more weight than anyone realizes. As for me, I spent more time on the land itself. The old dam continued doing exactly what my grandfather built it to do decades ago. The water reflected the changing seasons. Birds returned each year. Life moved forward. One evening, while cleaning out a storage cabinet in the barn, I found an old photograph tucked inside a weathered folder. It showed my grandfather standing near the shoreline shortly after completing the dam. His boots were muddy. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired and proud at the same time. I sat there for a long moment holding that photograph while sunlight filtered through the barn windows. The scent of old wood surrounded me. In that moment, the entire journey seemed to come full circle. He had built something meant to last. Not just the dam, not just the property, the principle behind it. Responsibility, stewardship, integrity. Those things mattered long after paperwork faded and titles changed hands. Looking back, I understand why people often underestimate patience. They mistake it for weakness. They assume silence means surrender. They believe power belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. But that is not what happened here. The people who tried to control everything relied on pressure and intimidation. The people who ultimately prevailed relied on facts, persistence, and cooperation. One approach created fear. The other created lasting change. Today, the property remains exactly where it has always been. The water still glimmers beneath the Texas sun. The road still winds through the fields. The community continues moving forward. And whenever someone asks what happened during those difficult months, I usually smile and tell them the simplest truth I know. Justice did not arrive all at once. It arrived one document, one conversation, and one determined neighbor at a time. In the end, the land stayed with the family that loved it, the community found its voice again, and the truth proved stronger than the people who tried to bury it. My grandfather would have appreciated that. After all, some things are worth defending. And some victories are measured not by what you gain, but by what you refuse to let disappear.